February 23, 2001. My name is Jerome Ferry. My cameraman is Alan Eggers. This morning we're doing an oral interview with Jack Walters at his home here at 3305 Willow Ridge in Marion. Jack, would you like to tell us a little bit about where you were born and where you grew up?
Sure. Good morning. I am Jack Walters. I was born January 8th, 1921 in Rockford, Illinois, and very shortly thereafter my parents moved back to Cedar Rapids. My dad was some kind of a grocery salesman, I guess, and they moved back to Cedar Rapids, and it wasn't long when they separated and he left and moved to California, and I was raised then in Cedar Rapids by my mother, who died early, and my grandmother. I've been asked by Mr. Ferry on behalf of the Historical Society to talk somewhat about aviation and how it affected me in my life, and to go way back to what really Mr. Ferry helped me remember. I think my very first interest in aviation came when my mother gave me a book written by Charles Lindbergh after Lindbergh did his over the Atlantic flight, and the book was entitled We, W-E, and that meant his airplane and Lindbergh himself. And I read that book as a youngster, and I was just fascinated by the fact that a man could do that. And of course, at that time, that was a great feat. My very first airplane flight was kind of an interesting one. I had a date with a girl in high school, and neither one of us had ever had an airplane flight. And out at the old Hunter Airport, there was an old, well, it wasn't old in those days, there was a Ford tri-motor airplane barnstorming around, and they were giving rides, and I don't even remember how much, but it probably strained my pocketbook if it was 50 cents a piece. Anyway, she and I went for a ride in that airplane, and I again, I was fascinated by the fact that you could get up in the air and fly around and look down on everything. After that, I didn't have much contact with aviation until a crazy set of circumstances happened in college where I was short in one category, mathematics, in order to get enough credits to graduate. And the war was on at that time, and Co-College came up with a plan with the government to teach students how to fly. The course was free, it was government financed, and you had to take the ground school to go with the flying, but you could learn to fly for free and get a license. And that would fill my mathematics category. So I signed up, little knowing what that would do to my life, of course. And I got through the ground school okay, and found out in ground school, by the way, what makes an airplane fly. And that just fascinated the heck out of me, that hurtling through the air passing over the wings created what I would call a vacuum, which was called lift, and still is called lift, and that's what makes an airplane fly. And I learned the physics and the aerodynamics of why an airplane flies, and the offshoot of it was that I also learned how to pilot an airplane. And we flew in out at the old Hunter Airport, We flew in the little small Aranca monoplane, and I remember some of the exciting things that happened to me. I tried to do a loop one time when I was on a solo flight, and all the dirt from the floor fell into my face because I didn't do it well. And there were a lot of other interesting things. But I got through that course, and I got up near the end of it, and the government threw a monkey wrench into the whole thing. In order to get credit for that course, you had to agree that you would, if need be, serve your country and enlist in one of the three air forces, Army, Navy, or Marines. Well, I didn't think I was good enough that I could ever land on a carrier, so I didn't think the Navy and the Marines would probably suit me. So ultimately, I went to Des Moines, signed up, and became at least a reserve member of the Army Air Corps in those days. And also connected to that condition of the government was, if need be, you would be called up. Well, in February 1943, the need arose, and they called us all up. And I can still remember sitting in economics class with my fiancée, now my wife, and one of our good friends came in waving his orders in his hand and said, "We're all called, and we have to report in about a week," I think it was. And it scared all of us to death, of course. But it was a fact, and we were called in, and that was 58 years ago right now, because my wife and I spent that economics class planning our wedding. And we got married on Valentine's Day, and we have just recently, a few days ago, celebrated our 58th anniversary. One thing led to another, of course, and we did go to, through all the rigmarole of becoming an aviation cadet, with all the terrible things that happened to all the guys at that time. And I did go through flying school, ultimately. I signed up to get into twin engine, and I did, in advanced flying, learn to fly a twin engine airplane. The other things I signed up for never went right, of course. Being married, I didn't want any hot airplane, and I didn't want anything very dangerous to do, so I wanted to be an ATC pilot and fly the safe airplanes. And as it turned out, a friend of mine who wanted the hottest stuff there was got ATC, and I ended up finally with the hottest twin-engine medium bomber that the Air Corps had, the B-26 Marauder. I went to Dodge City, Kansas for the B-26 transition, and then from there to Ellington Field in Houston, Texas for B-26 pre-combat training. And we had a lot of very interesting things happen to us, of course, trying to learn to fly that B-26. And ultimately, I flew an airplane. I took a new B-26 airplane from West Palm Beach, Florida, down the southern route through Puerto Rico, British Guiana, Belém and Natal, Brazil, Ascension Island, Liberia, Senegal, and Africa, and finally to Marrakesh in Morocco. There I had engine trouble with this brand new airplane and sat around for a long time before I could take off from there, and we flew up to England finally on Christmas Eve of 1940, what would that be, 1944, I guess it was. And then sat around in England in bad weather in January and February, and ultimately in February was sent to Paris, France for a replacement depot, and on to the bomb group where I flew combat. The bomb group was the 397th Bomb Group, commanded by a man by the name of Colonel Coiner, and they had a wonderful record of destroying bridges, the bomb group became known as Colonel Coiner's Bridge Busters. These two models are models of the B-26 Marauder airplane, and I'll tell you a little bit more about the Marauder in just a few minutes. As it turned out, I flew 31 combat missions, and those were all flown out of France, and the war ended then in Europe in, I believe it was in May. I'm not sure of the date of that one on VE Day, but I think it was in May that the war ended in Europe. And in August, I had the opportunity to come home, and of course jumped at that opportunity. Flew home, believe it or not, in a C-47 from England to Iceland, and we, after all this combat where we had no problems whatsoever, we were very fortunate. I crash landed as a passenger in a C-47, the safest old-time airplane there is. But we all walked away from that, and the pilot told us that he touched that thing down in a little hayfield at about 42 miles an hour. So you could slow fly a C-47 better than almost anything. From Iceland, I flew home to flew to the States, to Presque Isle, Maine, in a C-54, and got a 30-day leave and met my wife in Chicago, and we met the day before VJ Day, and I do remember that date. VJ Day was August 14th, and we had a wonderful opportunity to see Chicago in all its celebrating glory on VJ Day. And I might, as parenthetically, tell you also, I had been very fortunate in May to be on a leave in Paris on VE Day. And there's only one other guy I know of who was in Paris, France on VE Day, the wildest celebration I've ever seen in my life, and in Chicago, Illinois, at home on VJ Day. And we felt we were pretty fortunate. Well, I got a 30-day leave from there, and by the time I got out to California to be reassigned, the war was over in Japan, finally, and so one thing led to another, and I got discharged in November. From there, I came home and finished college, and Ann and I settled down to a civilian life and a life of raising one after another 4 kids. And aviation took a real back seat as far as my life was concerned. And of course, I didn't in that period of time, I didn't forget about it, but I was doggone busy raising a family and providing for them and so forth. Along about the 80s, I guess it was, earlier than that, in the 1970s, I got a phone call from a total stranger who asked me if I was the John Walters who flew B-26s in the 397th Bomb Group. I almost dropped the telephone because I hadn't heard from anybody except a couple of crew members that I'd kept track of anything at all about B-26s. And as a result of that phone call and subsequent contacts, I got interested in the 397th Bomb Group Association. And we went to some reunions, and Ann and I went to, in 1984, in 1984, I guess it was, we went to Normandy, France, on a reunion sponsored by the 397th Bomb Group Association for the 40th anniversary of D-Day. Now, I had not been in my bomb group on D-Day. I got there later as a replacement, but the bomb group had participated in the activities of D-Day. And one thing led to another again in that instance, and we figured this is an opportunity we should take advantage of, and we went on this wonderful trip to France, Belgium, Holland, and England with the bomb group. And my interest in aviation again began to be rekindled by my associating with some of these old timers like me from the Bomb Group Association. So I began to get more and more interested in the history, first of all, of the B-26. I knew it was a wild airplane to fly. I have to admit, I really didn't enjoy flying it. It was like driving a big truck in the air. And it didn't have any of the things that airplanes have today. It didn't have a lot of the things that some of our combat airplanes had in those days. We didn't have any oxygen, for example. We didn't have automatic pilot. We had to fly that thing by the seat of our pants constantly and work at it to fly it. And yet we flew formation. And I knew that there were a lot of crazy things about the airplane. I'd also had heard about the fact that in training down in Tampa Bay, in Tampa, Florida, they took off over Tampa Bay and they had so many accidents that they had a slogan about the B-26, a plane a day in Tampa Bay. Well, that was a bit of an exaggerated slogan, of course, but it was, there are a lot of airplanes in Tampa Bay, a lot of B-26s. So I thought I'd do some research on the airplane, and I became just fascinated with the history of the B-26 from its earliest conception to its production and finally to its utilization by the Air Corps as a combat airplane. And after meeting with some of the old timers and listening to some of their stories, I I decided that I'd really find out how it came into being. And the story of it is very interesting. I think it came into being because the Air Corps put out specifications for an airplane, medium bomber, that would fly in the neighborhood of 300 to 350 miles an hour top speed, which in those days was fast, would carry a heavy bomb load, could be used almost as a fighter plane, possibly a torpedo carrying airplane, and there were other specifications which in those days were almost unheard of. Well, the Glenn L. Martin Company in Baltimore had a designer, a young guy, a young engineer by the name of Peyton Magruder. And he went to work on this thing, and they submitted their prototype drawings and specifications for this kind of a medium twin-engine airplane. I believe it was North American also did one, and out of a total score of 1,000, the Martin model came up with about 813 points, I think it was, and won the contest. And the next one was 600 and some points, and that turned out to be the B-25 Mitchell. And we B-26 people had a lot of fun things to say about the B-25 Mitchell. But in any event, the B-25 came in second in that contest, and the B-26 won. So Martin got a contract. Unbelievably, the Martin B-26 Marauder, first airplane off the line, became the Air Corps' prototype. That had never happened before, that one had been produced so well that it was the prototype that they wanted. Well, there were a lot of things about the B-26 that were very unusual. And for its day, it was revolutionary in design. The skin on the fuselage and the wings, for example, was made of pieces that the edges were butted together rather than lapped. The rivets on the entire skin of the airplane were flush head rivets. They were not the little raised round heads. Those two things by themselves cut down drag tremendously, and actually the fuselage and the engine nacelles became airfoils as well as the wings and tail surfaces. That was, in its day, a revolutionary thing in the design of an airplane. And they built it with very short wings and two great big huge engines. Well, that made for very unusual flying characteristics. It was exciting and almost terrorizing to go down the runway with that thing wide open, with those two great big engines, and with a full load of bombs. Many's the time, and I did it several times, where you got to the end of 5,000 feet of runway and you were not airborne, so you bounced it one time in the grass, signaled wheels up, and the co-pilot put the wheels up, and you just hoped like heck it would fly. And usually it did. When it didn't, it was a disaster. The airplane was the first twin-engine airplane to have four-bladed props. And the pitch of those props was governed by, on the front of the propeller was an electric motor that turned the pitch of the props. And that was a very tricky piece of equipment. And the propellers on B-26s had a very bad habit of running away. I could give you the electronic thing that happened there, although it would be hard to describe that. But if that happened and the prop ran away, one prop ran away, there was no physical way that a pilot and co-pilot together could hold that thing straight and level and fly it on one engine on takeoff. And that's why they had all these terrible accidents in training. That's one of the reasons they had all these terrible accidents in training. The props would run away and you couldn't hold the airplane, and it went into the bay at Tampa. And that's why the Tampa plane a day. Fortunately, I never had a runaway prop. In all the times and all the takeoffs and landings I had with a B-26. But that was one of the unusual things. An interesting little sidelight, I think, is that for the tracks that on both sides of the bomb bay carried the 50 caliber ammunition back to the tail gunner, the tracks were manufactured by the Lionel Train Company. And I always thought that was a real interesting thing, that gee whiz, they thought up all kinds of funny ideas to make things work better. This was the first airplane which, for this top turret, had an electric system for that top turret to rotate. It would rotate 360 degrees. You could rotate it right past the rudder with the machine guns firing, and they had that calibrated in such a way that those machine guns would stop firing as they went by the rudder. And that worked, believe it or not. That was another innovation. Ultimately, that same top turret was used on B-24s and B-17s, and I'm not sure about the B-25. It might have been used on that B-25 also. This was the first medium bomber where the tail gunner could sit down in an upright sitting position. Before this airplane, all other tail gunners had to lie down on their stomach to fire their 50 caliber machine guns. But here, the tail gunner could sit up. I might give you a quick story. On the very first flight I had as a combat flight, the airplane right in front of us caught a flak burst and it just shredded the tail. And the glass in front of that tail gunner was gone. He was sitting out there, strapped in his seat, but he was sitting out there in front of God and everybody. and the left engine quit running, and so this guy's on, the crew is on single engine and a shredded tail. They brought that airplane home to home base. They did not complete their mission, but they brought the airplane home. The pilot landed it, And the story went that that tail gunner jumped out and kissed the ground. He was so happy to be back. And that was an indication an example is a better word of how tough the B-26 was in combat. They brought them home in a lot of cases that were just unbelievable stories.
How big a crew was on that?
How big of a crew?
The normal crew was 6. 3 officers, a pilot, co-pilot, and bombardier navigator, and 3 enlisted top turret gunner, waist gunner, and tail gunner. And those guys all had other jobs too. The top turret gunner was the engineer, the waist gunner was radio man, and the tail gunner was the bomb armor gunner, they called him.
Did you ever have the misfortune to lose a ship?
No, I did not. I hesitate to even tell you this because hardly anybody believes it. But in 31 combat missions where we got shot at all the time, I never had a flak hit, even. Never had a hole in the airplane. We had a little star up in front of the co-pilot's face on the windshield, and scared the heck out of him. But the windshield did not blow out or crack, and that's as close as we came. And I've said a few thank yous upstairs over and over again for that kind of a combat experience.
You must have had a guardian angel watching over you.
Evidently. Well,
Missions over Europe?
Cut it, no. Where you want to?
you might be interested also in the fact that my association with these people in the Bomb Group Association and then ultimately in the B-26 Marauder Historical Society, which evolved from the smaller bomb group associations. The fella I flew with, who was my co-pilot, lived then and still lives in Bethesda, Maryland. And he became a successful engineer in the Washington, D.C. area. And he, too, became very much interested in the historical significance of the B-26. And in 1990, it was decided that in Baltimore, which is near Bethesda, they would have a gigantic B-26 gala reunion in 1991, in April 1991. And they decided that they would have it then because that was the 50th anniversary of the delivery from the Martin plant of the first B-26 to the Army Air Corps. Well, as I've laughingly said many times, old veterans have all kinds of funny ideas about why to have reunions. And so these guys came up with that idea. And Nick being from Bethesda, they decided Nick should be the general chairman. And he took the job. And I got a phone call from that son of a gun. And he said, "Hey, I understand you've written some articles for the newspaper." And I said, "Oh, Nick, what's on your mind?" And he told me he was going to be the general chairman of this big gala. And he wanted me to be the national publicity chairman for the whole thing. I didn't have a computer in those days, and all I had was access through a friend of mine to a directory of all the newspapers in the country and the radio and TV stations and so on. But I couldn't turn Nick down. And so I took the job. And it was a tough job. But we did, between all of us that worked on that thing, if I do say so myself, we did a good job, and we turned out 1,500 people for that big blowout in Baltimore, and it was a real fun time by all, and gee whiz, we had some pretty notable people come. We even had people come from Europe, believe it or not, who had one connection or another with the B-26. And we got a lot of publicity too. I worked kind of hard at that. Well, after I had rekindled my interest in aviation through all this work with people and the Historical Society and the bomb group associations, I also discovered that there was a connection in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, between Cedar Rapids and the Wright brothers. Well, all of us at least vaguely know that the Wright brothers were the pioneers of aviation in the United States. But how many of us in Cedar Rapids, Iowa know there's any connection? So I got interested in that. Ann and I took a trip out east. We had a son in the Navy. We went out there and we ended up going up the islands that included Kitty Hawk, where the first flight was made in 1903. And at that point, I began to look, what about the connection to Cedar Rapids? And I found nothing in Kitty Hawk that had anything to do with the fact that the Wright brothers at one time lived in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Later, well, Ann and I saw the model of the first airplane, and we saw Kill Devil's Hill, where the big sand dune where the Wright brothers did their launching, at least, of their gliders and their airplane. Later, the 397th Bomb Group had another reunion at Dayton, Ohio, and that's where the Wright brothers went to live after they lived in Cedar Rapids. So I did some looking around in Dayton also, and the Wright brothers are all over Dayton. Their evidence of them is very much in evidence in Dayton, Ohio, but almost no reference anyplace, including a library and so on, to Cedar Rapids. Well, then I began to really get interested in why don't we in Cedar Rapids push the fact that the Wright brothers really and truly started here. And the way they started is their father was a minister and a bishop in his church, a Protestant minister and a bishop in this, I believe it was the United Brethren Church, and he was transferred to Cedar Rapids. And in the course of his work as a minister, he traveled quite a lot. The boys were 11 and 8 years old. Well, one time when Mr. Wright came back from one of his trips, he brought the boys a toy helicopter. And the story goes that they played with it right on the sidewalk, right beside where First Presbyterian Church is today on 3rd Avenue. And being 11 and 8 years old, this little helicopter made of paper and bits of wood and powered by a rubber band motor, I guess you could call it. It didn't last very long. But believe it or not, they saved the pieces. Wilbur saved the pieces so that he could maybe build another one. and his mother encouraged him. And the seeds of flight and why things could fly was sown in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, in the minds of these two little boys. 2 or 3 years later, they were transferred again. I believe it was to somewhere in Indiana, and then ultimately again to Dayton, Ohio, where they spent the rest of their growing up lives, at least, and went into business. They attempted to build a new helicopter from using the pattern of the pieces they had from their broken one. And being kids, and like almost anybody that is creative, they want to build a bigger one. So they did, and the bigger one wouldn't fly. Well, they didn't know the engineering principle of flight, that if you double the weight, you have to cube the power. So if the original one weighed 1 pound and had a certain power, and you built one that was 2 pounds, you had to cube the power of the first one. Well, the kids, of course, didn't know that principle. But they had inquisitive minds, and they read a lot, I found out in my research. They did all kinds of experiments themselves. They grew up in Dayton, and they remained bachelors all their life, by the way. They initially went into the printing business, and that failed. They didn't have a business that was profitable at all. But they had mechanical aptitude, so they went from the printing business into a bicycle shop. And that's where they made their living, in Dayton, Ohio. But they still had this interest in flying, and they'd read about people like Langley and Chanute, names that those of us who've done anything in aviation have heard those names. Panaud was another name that was big in aviation history. And the boys had read many of these books. They also read about these early pioneers in aviation having had terrible accidents. One man had an elaborate, crazy kind of a launching device on a yacht in the Potomac River. And on the second or third try, he crashed into the Potomac and killed himself. And that caused the Wright brothers to be very, very cautious. And they began to research, how did a bird fly? They observed gulls following a boat into the water, into the harbor, and how the gulls rode the air currents, and how if they got into the heat from the funnel of the boat, from the engine, how they would rise fast. They discovered, and this is one of the key discoveries that the Wright brothers made, they discovered that with buzzards flying, that as a buzzard soared, his wingtips changed, which caused him to roll and do his turn. They discovered what flying surfaces there needed to be in the tail of an aircraft to make it either pitch up and down, and the nose go up and down, or yaw to go back and forth. The rudder makes it go back and forth. The elevators make it go up and down. Now, what makes it roll? And this was the discovery they made on the wingtips of a buzzard. Watching them through binoculars, I guess, in those days, and they found that a buzzard had control of its feathers out on the end. And the most fascinating thing about that is it led to the invention by the Wright brothers of the aileron. And the aileron on the end of the wings is what makes the airplane roll, either back and forth, either left or right, back and forth. And I thought it was fascinating that they discovered that on a bird, for heaven's sakes. Well, I got really interested in the Wright brothers, of course, and they, in their bicycle shop, they could get no one to help them build an engine for an airplane. In 1900, they had contacted the U.S. Weather Service and found out where there were consistent, strong winds. And Kill Devil's Hill at Kitty Hawk in North Carolina was a favored place. So in 1900, they took a glider out there, took it up on this big hill, and they actually made it work. But it wasn't powered. It had no engine. But at least they found out that with the air currents, they could make this thing fly. 1901, they did it again. In 1902, some more. Finally, in 1903, after they had contacted manufacturers for a lightweight engine and had no help from any engine manufacturers, they built one themselves in the bicycle shop. And they did it so well, it developed way more horsepower than they expected. And they mounted it on what you have seen, no doubt, as that goofy-looking aircraft. And they made it, believe it or not, power 2 propellers. Well, they didn't know anything about counter pitch and so on, but they were smart enough that they knew they had to have them counter-rotating. Well, because they worked in a bicycle shop, obviously the thing that powered the propeller from the engine was a bicycle chain. What else? Bicycle guys would use a bicycle chain. And to make one counter-rotate different than the other one, they formed the bicycle chain into a figure 8 for the second one. And they took this model in December 1903. They took it out to North Carolina, and as you know, on December 17th, after a flip of the coin on which one would fly first and which would fly second, they took turns, and manned flight began. And it has changed the life of everybody in the world, of course, since, because we finally found out we could sit in an aircraft and fly in it. They didn't fly very far, but they found out they could do it. And Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, takes credit for first flight, of course. Justifiably so, they were there. Dayton, Ohio takes credit for the boys having grown up there and gone into business there. And Cedar Rapids, Iowa should take credit for the seeds of flight having been sown here in the very beginning. And then in my research, I found out one other most fascinating thing. All of us our age, at least, who lived in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and probably in the next generation, know that Alexander Lippisch was a wonderful aircraft designer of German origin who, when things got too rough in World War II, came to the United States. And he ended up, and his life ended in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, where he was an employee of Collins Radio. There's a connection between Alexander Lippisch and the Wright brothers. And I found this out through some research, and then had an interview with Mrs. Lippisch, his widow. And sure enough, when Alexander was a boy in Germany, Orville Wright had taken an airplane to Germany for demonstration purposes, and Alexander Lippisch was a little boy who went out to Tempelhof Parade Ground in Berlin and watched Orville Wright fly. And that sowed the seeds of Alexander Lippisch's greatness in aviation. It was the beginning, at least, of his interest in aviation. And he was the designer and originator of the Delta Wing in aviation. There are a few connections of the Wright brothers to Cedar Rapids. Out near the airport, the highway is the Wright Brothers Boulevard. There is a little mention, the last I saw, of the Wright brothers in an aviation display at the airport, but nothing that proclaims Cedar Rapids as the birthplace of Wright brothers flight. And then there's Wright School, an elementary grade school in Cedar Rapids. And the story is that Alexander Lippisch suggested, when it was time to name this new school, he suggested that it be named Wright School. And the school board at that time took his suggestion and did name it after Orville and Wilbur Wright. A B-24 pilot veteran of World War II became the first principal at Wright School. His name was Aldrich Ozzie Drehos, who, when I enlisted in the Air Corps, was with me down in Des Moines at exactly the same day. He also was going to CO at the time. He came home, became a teacher and then an administrator, and with his aviation background became the first principal of Wright School. Wright School is a place with a lot of the Wright brothers' history. There's a model of the airplane, the first airplane out there, and a wonderful set of 20-some pictures that came from the Aerospace Museum in Washington, thanks to Arthur Collins, who helped obtain those pictures that are displayed in the hallway out at Wright School. I have always felt that there should be more emphasis in Cedar Rapids on the fact that the Wright brothers, at least in their very earliest interest in their days of interest in aviation, had it start right here. I wrote some articles for the Cedar Rapids Gazette on that, and I think I've been inspired that I'm going to try and do that over again with this 2003 coming up as the 100th anniversary of first powered flight. Well, that pretty much wraps up what my interest in aviation is. I'm still fascinated by the fact that these great big airplanes, such as are used in the military and the big commercial airplanes like the 747, can fly. It's unbelievable to me that we can develop enough power and then enough lift on the surfaces of that airplane to make it fly. I'm constantly fascinated whenever I fly in an airplane that darn machine does what it does. It's wonderful, and I want to thank you for letting me be a part of having this opportunity to make a video, all of which or part of which may be used for the 100th anniversary celebration. I hope we have a good celebration in Cedar Rapids. Thank you.
Very good. I had a question. You took your initial training, of course, out to Hunter Airport. Do you remember much about Hunter at that time? Was it pretty primitive, or were the airplanes? Or
well, it was compared to today.
Yes,
very primitive. Yes, it was.
I guess primitive wouldn't be the correct word, but quite a bit different than what it is today.
Oh yes. Well, the airfield itself was small. It had gravel airstrips. I can't tell you how long they were, but there weren't any big airplanes that came in. It wasn't big enough, for example, even for a C-47 to come in. And Iowa City had the first really commercial airport in this area. It was a big square field.
Yeah. Was there a class of you? Was there like 10, 20 of you taking a class all at the same time?
Yes.
And there was an airplane for each one?
Oh, I doubt that. I'll give you an example. Let's say that there were 20 in the class. There might have been 5 airplanes. And we all alternated in who would fly what airplane. And you didn't get the same airplane each time. I also had that experience in military, that I never had my own airplane. In many cases, even in combat, or particularly I should say in combat, some crews had their own airplane. In my experience, that was not so.
Did you ever have the opportunity to meet Dan Hunter? Did you ever know the man, or?
No, I did not. Well, I had met him, yes, but I did not know him well.
Being you were just a student there, you didn't have the opportunity to have any relationship with him.
I knew of him, of course. He was a well-known figure in Cedar Rapids in those days. And I did know his son, who was about my age.
Dan Jr.?
Dan Jr. I didn't know him well. I think he was a little bit younger than I, and in those days, in that age group, if you're 1 year younger, you're out of the loop, you know. But he and I knew each other.
Did he, was he taking training lessons at the time you were, or was he more or less hanging around the airport at that time?
Oh, no, my recollection does not come up with anything that he was Dan Jr. was learning to fly, no. And I don't know if he ever, well, I suppose he did learn to fly, but I was not aware of that.
Well, Jack, this has been a very informative interview, and I think we ought to invite your wife, Ann, to join us.
Well, we're back here, I guess, and I'd like to introduce to you my wife, Ann, who was my college sweetheart, and who, in the early part of the interview, I told you we got married on Valentine's Day 58 years ago, and she followed me around on this military training, and she knew all the scuttlebutt long before the guys did, all the wives did. And anyway, Ann followed me around and has tolerated this interest of mine in aviation very well.
How many children?
We have 4 children. We had 2 boys and 2 girls.
Well, the History Center wants to thank you both very much for giving us the amount of time you did. It's been very enjoyable. Thank you very much.
Well, the pleasure was all mine.
I learned a lot listening to him this morning,
Well, good.
things I didn't know about. So.
Thank you.